Good day. As I make this program, news has been trickling in that President Biden has somewhat furtively visited Kiev and has met with President Zelensky, and there are pictures and photographs of him with President Zelensky. I noticed, by the way, that President Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, was there also. Anyway, they're all in Kiev, and there have been some discussions, obviously, and there's also been several statements made by President Biden, once again reaffirming his personal support for Ukraine. There's also talk of a further arms package, though the text of President Biden's comments suggests that it will be small. Now, there may be a lot more coming from this visit. I'm not going to anticipate any further announcements that might be made, and I'm not going to give a full assessment of what this visit is all about until we have rather more concrete information to go upon. But I am going to make one very general observation, which I think latest events, not just this visit, but the information we've obtained from Seymour Hersh about the run-up to the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines, well, taken together, that makes, I think if you take all that information together, this conclusion is irrefutable. This is that so long as President Biden remains in office, or at any rate in control of the US government, however, nominal that control might be, serious steps towards a negotiated solution of the Ukraine conflict are not going to happen, or at least they're not going to originate from within the United States. It is very clear to me that President Biden himself is now far too deeply invested in this Ukraine venture, both politically and emotionally, to pull back from it. It's a little bit like what happened in the 1960s with President Lyndon Johnson over Vietnam. He also, though coming to the Vietnam conflict apparently with a lot more skepticism than President Biden has done with respect to the Ukraine conflict, well, President Johnson in the 1960s eventually became also so invested in Vietnam, so unable to change policy or his own positions over Vietnam, that peace talks between the United States and North Vietnam only became possible after President Johnson announced that he would not be standing for re-election as President of the United States in the presidential election of 1968. So we are obviously not in that position yet. There's a lot of discussion about whether President Biden really will stand, and at the moment all the indications are that he does indeed wish to do so. But as I said, for the moment, whilst Biden himself continues as President of the United States, it's going to be exceptionally difficult, all but impossible, I would say, for the United States at least to change course. That means that the conflict will continue, negotiations of any serious nature will fail to take place, unless, of course, there is a major political reshuffle, unless President Biden is either forced from office or whatever levers of control he still exerts are finally taken from him. Anyway, I'm going to discuss this in more detail in, I think, a specific dedicated program to this matter, discussing this matter on the Duran with my colleague Alex Christoforou. In the meantime, we continue to get lots of information, news about what's going on in the battlefields in Ukraine. And the key news there is that the Russians are still pushing forward hard in Bakhmut and apparently towards Kupiansk further north. Now, in Bakhmut, it seems that they have now largely encircled a town called Berhova, which is apparently another part of what you might call the Bakhmut conurbation. And Berhova is very close to one of the main roads, one of the last remaining roads, coming from Chasov Yar into Bakhmut. The general view seems to be that once this particular town is captured, all the major access points to Bakhmut are going to be finally and fully unusable by Ukraine. Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut will then be reduced to relying on the country lanes and open fields in which either to get supplies, which I've discussed, I think is going to be extremely difficult, or to retreat from. But anyway, one way or the other, it does look as if the ring around Bakhmut is steadily closing. The pincers are gradually coming together. And as I say, we will see what happens over the next few hours and days. And there's been a flurry of comments about what's going on in Bakhmut in the Russian media. And we're starting to see all sorts of reports about the fighting in and around Bakhmut. And for example, there's been this report from TASS, which references, again, Yan Gagin, one of the officials of the Donetsk People's Republic. He says that Russian forces are gradually encircling Artyomovsk, called Bakhmut by Ukraine, and are preparing to deliver strikes on the town's western portion. Urban battles are already raging in Artyomovsk. If we look at the map of the ongoing battle, Artyomovsk is being closed in on and is half encircled. Russian troops are currently preparing for artillery bombardments of the town's western portion, but its observation is impeded so far. In practical terms, when we see a target or an object, we can aim at it and so on. That is, we have made preparations for our artillery to reach that part of the town. For the time being, we cannot yet reach it because we need to observe targets to take aim at. Now, I would say actually that's a slightly odd comment, because I have actually seen, from what I presume are Ukrainian sources, a video which appears to show explosions from presumably shelling going on in precisely this area that Gagin is talking about as being difficult for Russian artillery to aim at. But overall, the drift of his comments is fairly clear. The Russians are gradually gaining control of more and more of Bakhmut, and that they are tightening their encirclement of Bakhmut. And in fact, Gagin is again reported by TASS as saying rather more about this. He says that the seizure of Bakhmut is a matter of time, but Russian troops should not hurry to capture the town. As for the prospects of liberating Artyomovsk, that's of course how Russian officials refer to Bakhmut, I believe we should not hurry. When I'm asked about why it takes so long, I simply invite such people to the front line. Come and see what it looks like to be here, to understand why we are moving forward so slowly. We're now trying to spare personnel and strike the enemy manpower as accurately as possible. By and large, the seizure of Artyomovsk is a matter of time, but I would not hurry and would keep grinding down the enemy. This is practicable, and this has already been tested. Contrary to the Kiev regime's hype about Artyomovsk, Bakhmut in other words, as a fortress city and a place where they will be able to show the courage and steadfastness of their soldiers, it has become a point of disposing of Ukrainian servicemen, Gagin stressed. They have lost thousands and thousands of fighters there. On some days, they lose 100 of personnel a day, which is a heavy toll on this section of the front line. The bodies of those killed are not collected, and they just lie on the battlefield. So that's, you see, Gagin coming along telling us that the fighting is essentially, as we've described, slow, incremental, grinding siege warfare. Ukrainian forces being ground down, an expression Russian officials, Russian military commanders have been repeatedly using ever since General Surovikin, who I personally think is still the theatre commander, first made it way back in an interview he gave with Russia, one TV station, I believe back in September, at any rate, all the way back in autumn. The Russian approach to this war is to grind the Ukrainians down, and that is what Gagin says that the Russians are doing in Bakhmut. And they're in no hurry to take it, because the more troops and reinforcements and supplies Ukraine sends to try to hold on to Bakhmut, the more Ukraine gets ground down, and that plays to the Russian attrition strategy, the one which Western leaders are so anxious for Ukraine to break away from, though I've discussed the problems with doing that in previous programs. Anyway, that's news. That's the news from the Bakhmut front. We'll see how long this fighting takes there. We'll also see whether it is indeed the case, as I suspect, that once Bakhmut falls, the Russians will move quite quickly to capture the commanding heights west of the town, and whether that will indeed put them in a position, as Ukrainian commanders have also said, of actually sighting their artillery on the high ground so that they can shell Slavyansk and Kramatorsk in the lowlands below. Anyway, we will see what happens, but it does seem as if the fighting in Bakhmut, which, let me reiterate again, remains the major battlefield, that is continuing incrementally, grindingly, but the Russians steadily, step by step, moving closer to their objectives. Now, it's not just Gagin who has been talking. We've also heard comments from other Russian officials. I say Russian officials, though the one I'm going to cite now is Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the head of the Chechen government and the de facto commander of the Chechen forces, overall commander of the Chechen forces, who are also fighting alongside the Russian military in Ukraine, or at least in this conflict in Ukraine. The Russians would say that the places where this fighting is going on are now Russian rather than Ukrainian. I will not get sidetracked into a discussion of that. But anyway, Kadyrov has now said that his forces, the Chechen forces, have achieved some kind of significant advance in the Seversk area. He says that fighters from the Akhmat Commando Unit, together with a battalion of the 2nd Army Corps of the Lugansk People's Republic Militia, have taken a strategic height in the outskirts of the settlement of Belogorovka. And the importance of this, according to Kadyrov, is as follows. Fierce battles for control of that strategic height have been going on for long. After tense fighting, our units seized control of about 5 kilometers of terrain and also are approaching to the railroad leading to Seversk, which by itself gives our side considerable advantages in that frontline area. And he's saying all of this apparently on his Telegram channel. And then he goes on to say that Kyrgyz Musikhanov, a Chechen officer who was briefly who was in Ukrainian captivity, is now the commander of a special operations company and is achieving splendid results in one of the most important frontline areas. Now, back in August, the officials of the Lugansk regional government twice claimed that Seversk, which is this smallish town at the northern end of the Zelensky line that leads all the way up from Bakhmut, that Seversk had actually been captured by the Russian forces. Turned out on both occasions that this was simply untrue. And in fact, there were reports around that time, this is back in August, that what was making the capture of Seversk difficult was that the Ukrainians were in control of the high ground around it, and that made it very difficult for the Russian forces to push forward and to capture Seversk. I believe that the real reason why the Russians didn't capture Seversk at that time was that they didn't commit enough forces to do it. This is the time shortly after the fighting in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, when a large number of Russian contract soldiers, their contracts expired and they went back into civilian life, and Russian forces in Ukraine fighting in the operation zone became severely depleted, and that the major focus already at that point was Bakhmut, but also in trying to advance near Donetsk city itself. This is the time when the Russians switched their main axis of advance towards villages like Pesky near Donetsk city. And the result was that the attack on Seversk was not pursued with any very great energy. But it is undoubtedly the case that there was high ground around Seversk, and that this did complicate Russian operations around Seversk. And I do get the impression that what Kadyrov is talking about here is that the Russians are now gradually, or at least I should say the Chechens, but the Chechens at the vanguard alongside the Russians are gradually making progress, taking control of the high ground around Seversk. And note what Kadyrov says about a railway. He says that the Russian forces, the Chechen forces, are now approaching the railway leading to Seversk. And I'm assuming that this is one of the major transportation systems that have enabled the Ukrainians to keep their force in Seversk supplied. And if it is indeed the case that the railway leading to Seversk is now coming under threat, maybe the Russians are in a position to carry out artillery strikes against it. Well, in that case, then it seems to me that the position of the Ukrainian forces in Seversk itself is now becoming increasingly precarious, and perhaps the concern expressed earlier, apparently by General Zelensky, or reportedly by General Zelensky to President Zelensky, that Seversk is ultimately undefendable since the fall of Soledar. Maybe that will turn out to be proved true at some point over the next few weeks. And perhaps, and those were the reports that were circulating a few weeks ago around the time of the fall of Soledar, maybe it's also the case that once the railway is taken and the other roads are taken and access to Seversk is interrupted, maybe, just possibly, the Ukrainian troops in Seversk will be put in a position where they must either withdraw or find themselves in another encirclement or cauldron. Anyway, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's see what happens, but that's what Kadyrov is saying. Now, all of this is taking place, as I said, on the battlefields, Bakhmut, Seversk. There's also been some reports that the Russians are still pushing forward slowly towards Kupiansk, and there's even some suggestions that the Ukrainians are preparing some sort of withdrawal from Kupiansk. I have to say, if so, that would be a novelty, because up to now, Ukraine has never withdrawn from any position at all that it has occupied or taken, at least not that I can remember. But anyway, let's wait and see what is going on there. But as I think I discussed a short time ago in one of my recent videos, there's been a lot of discussion by some Western officials about the difficulties the Russians are experiencing around Vuhledar. And it does indeed seem the case as if the initial Russian advance on Vuhledar, this is the town in the south of Donetsk region, which is connected in some form with the fighting near Donetsk city, places like Marinka, that the Ukrainians rushed reinforcements to Vuhledar and did indeed succeed in slowing down the Russian advance there, and were even able to push the Russians back in some places. And by the way, this provoked a great deal of, as I said, commentary on the part of some Western officials. There was even some talk about a Russian defeat in Vuhledar. Well, we've heard over the last couple of hours some reports from various Russian telegram channels which discuss the fact that there have been Ukrainian counterattacks in a number of places, in the Kremenaya region, in the areas southwest of Bakhmut city, presumably from Chasov Yar. I discussed that particular counterattack, or reports of a counterattack, some days ago, and around Vuhledar. And the consensus view amongst these Russian telegram channels is that all of these counterattacks in the end were unsuccessful. The Ukrainians suffered losses and were pushed back to their start lines. And there's some reports that the Russians have again resumed some kind of incremental battle for Vuhledar, though, as I said, it's clearly a tough fight for them. Again, I'm going to say that the problem the Russians have basically run into in Vuhledar looks to me to be very similar to the one they encountered back in August in the fighting around Seversk. The size of the Russian force that has been attacking Vuhledar has been relatively small. It consists of that naval infantry brigade that has been fighting in this area, well, since almost the start of the war, supplemented by some of the admittedly best units of the Donetsk militia, in specifically Khodorkovsky's Vostok battalion. And this is just not enough, or so it seems to me, to capture Vuhledar fast, and it has led to more of this grinding attrition war that we see. The Russians have large numbers of troops concentrating and gathering, and they're building up forces in various parts of the conflict line. But as I've said already, they have never so far committed these troops in any number to any part of the battlefronts. They appear to be holding them back for some reason, which I'm going to discuss or speculate about in a moment. But there are some reasons to think that this might be changing. I said that there is reports a couple of days ago that something like 2,000 more Wagner assault troops were seen in Melitopol, arriving there in coaches. They could be Wagner troops, they could be other troops, who knows, who can be sure. But it's now increasingly looking as if they're going to be sent to reinforce the Russian forces in Vuhledar. And if, of course, they are Wagner troops, which they might be, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how big the Wagner organization is by this point. But if they are Wagner troops, it could be that they're being sent to Vuhledar because after the long, slow, grinding attrition battles around Bakhmut, these Wagner fighters, or their commanders, have now become the acknowledged specialists within the Russian military in what you might call siege warfare, and that is what the Russians are essentially facing in Vuhledar. Everywhere else, as far as I can see, the front lines are stable. Over the course of President Biden's visit to Kiev, there were air raid alarms switched on across Ukraine, but as far as I can see, this was some sort of precautionary measure, presumably connected with President Biden's visit. It doesn't seem as if some major missile or assault strike was taking place over the time when Biden was actually in Kiev. Right, now, there's been an awful lot more discussion and rumour and speculation about what the Russians are going to do. And there's been further concentrated discussion about all of this, connected with the recent announcement that on the 21st of February, President Putin is going to deliver his State of the Union address to the Russian Federal Assembly. This had been delayed, postponed from last year. There was an awful lot of rumour, discussion, speculation about what that was all about. And I can remember a whole flurry of newspaper articles and commentaries appearing in the Western media at that time and speculating about the fact that President Putin had not conducted his famous annual press conference, the one press marathon. Anyway, it now seems definitely that President Putin will be holding this press conference, this Federal Assembly speech on the 21st of February. And we're getting more and more reports that this is going to focus principally on the special operation, the conflict, in other words, in Ukraine. Now, I'm not going to try and guess what Putin is going to say because I don't know. And one of the things that we should all have realized by now is that the Kremlin knows how to protect its secrets. They're not giving away any information about what Putin is going to say, other than, as I said, that the conflict in Ukraine is going to be the centerpiece of the speech. But, or inevitably perhaps, there are now rumors that when Putin does deliver his speech, there's going to be a major resumption, acceleration, intensification of the Russian military operation, that we're going to see some kind of offensive being launched, some big rolling offensive of some type being launched across Ukraine. Well, we'll just have to wait and see whether that is actually the case. But there are one or two rather interesting facts. Firstly, and this has been commented on now by a fair number of people, we're starting to see Russian aircraft apparently operating more openly and aggressively over Ukrainian territory. There's been reports that Russian fighter jets have been flying over parts of Ukraine which they had tended to avoid up to now, and that they're flying at increasingly high altitudes and are able to do so with relative impunity. Now, I don't know whether this is so, but I have seen some reports to that effect. Simplicius the Thinker, one of that somewhat erudite blogger who was commenting, whose commentaries about the conflict I discussed some days ago was talking about this. And Simplicius the thinker suggests that the fact that Russian aircraft are now overflying Ukraine and doing so with impunity and at relatively high altitudes suggests that Ukraine's stock of S-300 air defense missiles is now essentially exhausted, and that the Russians feel able to operate at these altitudes because the Ukrainian air defense system and the Ukrainian Air Force have essentially been defeated. Well, I don't know whether that's true. I don't know whether these high altitude flights are even happening. But if they are, that is interesting. And it's also been suggested, and this is indisputably the case, that these aircraft, Sukhoi 24s, rather old aircraft, but also Sukhoi 30s, much more modern, and Sukhoi 34s are now being equipped, have been equipped with long-range, precision-guided systems. These would presumably be principally the KH-38 missile family. There's been pictures of Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy head of Russia's Security Council, and also now the deputy head of Russia's Military Industrial Commission, touring factories in which there have been pictures of these missiles, these KH-38 missiles. Anyway, there's been pictures, they've been shown on the factory assembly floors. Well, maybe more of these are now have been produced, and they're being supplied to the aircraft, and we might start to see more attacks with these missiles across Ukraine. Anyway, the other point, of course, and it goes back to a discussion I had some weeks ago, is that, of course, we're talking about Ukrainian defense lines, trenches, pillboxes, bunkers, those sort of things. I've had several people now, quite a few people now, but especially that particular viewer from India who has provided me with so much technical information, for which I'm really grateful. Anyway, the point is that the best and most effective way, apparently, to break defences, these fortified lines, would be with gravity bombs. So perhaps the appearance of these aircraft is that the Russians are testing the air, if you like, testing the airspace, seeing whether it is indeed the case that Ukraine has run out of its missiles, and are readying some kind of big aerial offensive, which may be coming over the next few days and weeks. I don't know. Anyway, but it is intriguing, and we shall see. If there is such an aerial offensive, combined with missile strikes and all of that, long-range missile strikes, then that could indeed suggest some sort of big Russian offensive coming. I don't know whether that is the case or not. The Russians still talk about grinding Ukrainian defences down, but it may be that some sort of offensive is indeed going to be launched at some point at the end of February, perhaps to coincide with President Putin's speech. I'm not going to discuss this or speculate about this more. What I would say is that there's a lot of rumour about this all over the internet. We'll just have to see whether or not that is the case. But if it is indeed the case that Russian aircraft are indeed flying at high altitudes over Ukrainian-controlled territory, then that might indeed be a pointer in that direction. What is indisputably the case, however, is that setting aside whatever announcements may come in terms of arms deliveries from the United States that might flow from President Biden's visit, there does now seem to be a critical shortage of equipment from the West. Firstly, there's now been a multiplicity of reports, including one in the London Times, that Ukraine is only going to get a quarter of the tanks, Western tanks, it was promised. It's apparently expecting to get something like 100 by late March, 200 rather, by late March, early April. This would presumably have been a mixture of tanks, 14 Challenger 2s, 88 Leopard 2s, a significant quantity of Leopard 1s. Anyway, there was this wide expectation that there would be large numbers of Western tanks, or at least some Western tanks, supplied in, around 200 of them. But this has failed to materialize. And for the moment, it seems that Britain is only able to supply 4 Challenger 2 tanks in March. 3 Leopard 2 tanks are coming from Portugal, all from the London Times. And the Leopard Battalion from Germany is only half ready. I don't quite know what that means, but I'm guessing that means that there won't be the 14 tanks that Germany has promised. They're going to have to be refurbished as well. So for the moment, Ukraine is only getting a fraction of the number of tanks that it expected to have. Poland is going to send another 14 Leopard 2 tanks in the near future, but we don't know how much in the future that is. I, by the way, heard 30 at one time from Poland. Perhaps that number's been scaled down. The Poles are also, of course, sending more T-72s. That doesn't seem to be included in these totals, but the total number of Western tanks is turning out to be significantly less than expected within any acceptable time frames. At least acceptable if you're thinking about an armored offensive over the next few weeks. And meanwhile, Josep Borrell, I'm going to call him the EU's foreign minister, that's not actually his formal title. A fervid hardliner has come forward and has said that there are now only weeks left to rectify Ukraine's ammunitions crisis, and that unless this is done, the war ends. He didn't quite say what he means by that, and it sounds a rather melodramatic language, but presumably war ends means that Ukraine can't sustain the war, and presumably some sort of collapse would in that case be underway. I think that's an exaggeration, by the way. I'm sure that Ukraine will be able to keep up some kind of fight, even if it does run out of shells. It will presumably hold back some. There may be a crisis for Ukraine, but I don't think we're looking exactly at the end of the war within a few weeks. But anyway, that is the melodramatic language that Borrell was using. And he said that he was convening an urgent meeting of EU foreign and defence ministers to try and sort out these problems with shells. And from his words, from the language that he was using, it's absolutely clear that what he was talking about is not new production of shells. I think that's basically a project that has been abandoned. There's been a lot of discussion about this, but it's going to be years before Western production of 155 millimeter shells is on such a scale that it can both meet Ukrainian needs, fulfill total Ukrainian needs, as well as Western needs, because you need to do both. Anyway, what Borrell seems to be talking about is depleting the arsenals of European states, EU states, but of course also NATO states, even further. In other words, whatever shells they still have, 155 millimeter shells, they must dust them out and supply them, ship them all to Ukraine. And a couple of days ago, before that, he was saying exactly the same thing about tanks, that European lead countries should go through all their warehouses, check whatever tanks they still have in their warehouses, dust them off, refurbish them in some way, and also send them to Ukraine. It all sounds bizarre. It really does sound like a case of demilitarizing yourself, as some people are rather facetiously saying, giving all your weapons, in effect, to Ukraine, gambling on Ukraine surviving or winning the war. Because, of course, if you don't, and you've got no shells or artillery or tanks, I suppose, left, well, presumably you're going to be in trouble if something else happens around the world and you need to find your weapon systems. You need weapons to deal with it. But anyway, that is what Josep Borrell is now saying. And I'm going to suggest that this is an urgent problem. The fact that Borrell is talking in this way shows not just that it is an urgent problem, but that there is no real solution to it, because the solution he's coming up with is a desperate one. His comments, on the one hand, reveal the intense depth of his commitment to Ukraine and to this war, one matched by people like Annalena Baerbock, Ursula von der Leyen, and, as we now see, President Biden and his team of officials. But the difficulty is that they're running out of tools. Yet, rather than start addressing the problem of their lack of tools and perhaps start thinking of a way out, they are doing what Sunak says. They're doubling down. They're gambling by sending whatever remaining shells they have, or at least that's what Borrell wants them to do, to Ukraine. It seems so strange, so disproportionate, so visceral, that it's as if logic and reason, perhaps never in abundant supply in Washington and Brussels and London and those capitals. Anyway, that logical reason, such as there was, has finally ebbed away. Anyway, I say that because it wasn't just Wang Yi who was present in force at the Munich Security Conference. It was also the leaders of many other states. They were all invited there, and it's fairly clear now that the Western leaders invited these leaders or officials from states from Africa, Latin America, Asia, to Munich, because the Western powers were hoping or expecting to be able to carry out some major lobbying effort against, with the leaders of these countries, to try to get them to come on side with the West over Ukraine. And it's now absolutely clear that in doing this, the Western states failed completely. There's a long article about this in the Financial Times. Now, it's behind a paywall, and I'm only going to read it in part, but it says this. The title reads, Western pleas over Ukraine failed to sway African and South American leaders. US and European leaders struggle to convince the rest of the world that Russia's invasion is a threat to all. And then it goes on to say that Western leaders use an important security meeting in Munich to make the case that Russia's invasion of Ukraine posed a threat not just to Europe, but to the whole world. There was little evidence their message got through. Speaking at the Munich Security Conference, a clutch of senior US and European officials sought to convince the rest of the world of the threat posed to them by President Vladimir Putin's invasion and show them that blame for higher global food and energy prices lay with Moscow. Yet their attempts to portray the war in universal terms met familiar retorts. Brazilian Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira said that the conflict was very sad, a situation, and stressed his government deplored invasion, but in a message that jarred with the stance of Western attendees, calling for a resolve to fight a long war in Ukraine, Vieira added, it's been 1 year now, we have to try to build the possibility of a solution. We cannot keep talking of war. Borrell talking only of war. Biden in Kiev talking only of war. But everyone else criticizing this, saying that this doesn't make any kind of sense. And Financial Times goes on to say there was palpable frustration among some leaders from African and South American nations that the war in Ukraine was consuming time, money, and attention of the West at the expense of other pressing problems. Francia Marquez, the Vice President of Colombia, said that her country wanted Europe's help tackling the fallout from climate change and protecting the Amazon rainforest. We don't want to go on discussing who will be the winner or loser of a war. We are all losers, and in the end, it is humankind that loses everything. Namibian Prime Minister Sarah Kugongelwa Amadila, apologies to anybody, by the way, if I'm mispronouncing the names of these people, was asked why her country, along with China, India, and 32 other nations, abstained from a UN resolution in October that saw 143 countries declare the Russian annexation of several Ukrainian regions as illegal. She said that Namibia was focused on resolving the problem, not on shifting blame. The bottom line is that money used to buy weapons would be better used to promote development in Ukraine, in Africa, in Asia, in the EU itself, where many people are facing hardships. Western officials said bilateral meetings on the conference sidelines revealed a much greater preoccupation with inflation, debt, higher energy prices, and food security than with the war in Ukraine. There was also a lingering resentment over the West's disappointing record in sharing, medications during the pandemic and compensation for the damage caused by climate change. It then goes on to talk about this same Financial Times article, goes on to talk about China's stance. And I should say that Wang Yi, the Chinese Politburo member, the former foreign minister of China, has now made certain further comments in which he's made it absolutely clear that as far as China is concerned, the onus is on the United States to change its policy over Ukraine in order to make some kind of solution to the conflict there possible. Anyway, before those comments by Wang Yi, The Financial Times goes on to say, again talking about China, China's stance on the conflict loomed large over the Munich gathering, along with tensions between Beijing and Washington. Amrita Narlikar, president and professor at the Hamburg-based German Institute for Global and Area Studies, said that European and American officials needed to do better in countering what she called China's very clever framing of itself as a part of the developing world, where it promotes itself as a partner to help nations safeguard their sovereignty and boost development. And I mean, I find that comment, by the way, so astonishing that I'm not going to say more about it, countering China's comments about, it's the way that China addresses the third world, what was the third world, the global south, the developing world, all of that. I think, I will just say this in parenthesis, that this constant way in which the West talks about the global south, the developing world, even the expression third world still gets used from time to time. I think that's not only out of date. I think in much of the world today, those kind of labels have come to be seen as deeply condescending and reflective of a certain Western mindset. In saying that, I of course concede that I also use the expression global south from time to time. I say that because one has to come up with some kind of shorthand to discuss the nations outside the West, or the non-aligned nations if you prefer. But anyway, I think talking in this way, the way that Narlikar is speaking, I don't think I was going to. I think that already explains why most of the world is not impressed with much of what the West is saying about China. But anyway, to continue with what Narlikar was talking about, and again, I'm taking this from the Financial Times. Narlikar said a peace plan for the Ukraine conflict that Beijing has promised to publish in the coming days. As I said already, what peace plan? I've not seen any reference to anyone from China talking so far about a peace plan. A position paper proposing ideas, yes. But I don't yet see evidence that the Chinese are coming up with a peace plan or that they're intent on any kind of peace initiative. But anyway, coming back to Narlikar, Narlikar said a peace plan for Ukraine conflict that Beijing had promised to publish in the coming days, drawing skepticism from European and US officials, would probably target not just the West. Equally important, the global South can be expected to be the audience. If China were to present its vision as one of a peace dialogue between Russia and Ukraine and emphasize the global economic costs of a long-drawn war, this would enjoy considerable support in large parts of the global South. The West needs to get its act together and build more inclusive and winning narratives. Well, just take a step back and think about all of this. Isn't it correct that from the perspective of most of the world, they want to see the war end? Why is a peace dialogue between Russia and Ukraine a bad thing? Why not emphasize the global economic costs of a long-drawn war? Why not point out that nobody gains from that war? And yet, these words of sense, people like Borrell, people like Narlikar, other Western officials at the Munich Security Conference, presumably President Biden himself, they all recoil from them. They want to continue the war. They want to go on fighting it. Fighting it to what end? Well, they say to weaken Russia, and it's indeed the case that thousands of Russians have been killed. That's indisputable. But tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are being killed as well. Ukraine is being devastated. European arsenals are being depleted. The United States itself is now confronting major problems, shortfalls in its own arsenal. There's increasing concerns from people like Josh Hawley. I discussed this recently in another video, increasing concerns that this overcommitment to Ukraine is diverting energy and resources away from where the United States needs to focus, from the competition with China, from other things. But let's disregard all of that. Let's disregard what most of the world thinks. Let's ignore what the Chinese are saying. Let's be nervous about this because, of course, what the Chinese are saying, let's find a way to end this war. Let's seek a diplomatic solution. Let's try and negotiate some kind of a settlement that satisfies the core interests of both sides. Let's acknowledge that continuation of the war is causing major economic problems. Let's acknowledge that a prolonged war, which, remember, the Rand Corporation has issued a report saying that the United States also stands to lose from a long war. Well, let's disregard all of that. Let's come away angry and frustrated when leaders from around the world, officials from around the world, from Brazil, from Namibia, from China, from India, from Indonesia, from other countries, tell us these things. Let's come away frustrated and angry. Let's ignore the advice of the Rand Corporation. Let's send all our remaining ammunition to Ukraine. Oh, and let's not talk about the fact that our own pipelines got blown up, and it doesn't seem as if the Russians did it. And there's now reports circulating, including from a journalist of the stature of Seymour Hersh, suggesting that that was organized by the government of the United States. I have to say that this is all sounding to me increasingly deranged. It's becoming, frankly, so bizarre that it looks as if all rationality is being lost. And in the run-up to President Biden's visit, as it turns out, to Ukraine, though, of course, at the time when this report, which was in Politico, came out, it was not known that he would go to Ukraine, that he would not be visiting Kiev. It was all assumed that he was just coming to Europe and would be going to Warsaw and only there. But anyway, in the run-up to President Biden's visit, there was a report in Politico that the United States is again urging Ukraine to launch an offensive. And perhaps the Ukrainians are taking that to heart because, as Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama has pointed out, it seems as if the Ukrainians have pulled back all their remaining tanks from the main battlefields, a fact which would probably increase the loss rate of their soldiers, who are no longer protected by the armor that the tanks can provide. There was a report, by the way, the other day in another Western media outlet, I forget which one, that half of Ukraine's T-64 tanks, the ones it started the war with, have been destroyed. I suspect it's a lot more than that. But anyway, that Ukraine has pulled back all its remaining tanks, that they're not visible on the battlefronts. Perhaps Ukraine is indeed husbanding them, collecting them. so that he can launch this offensive. After all, it looks like by April it's only going to get 50 tanks, 50 Western tanks. There may be another 100 tanks from Poland, T-72s, modernized, refurbished T-72s. But, we cobbled together a tank force from what's left of Ukraine's own tank fleet. We add to that the T-72s from Poland and the ones apparently stolen from Morocco. If what the Moroccans say is true, the Moroccans claim that they sent their tanks to the Czech Republic for refurbishment, and that the Czechs then went on and forwarded them to Ukraine against Moroccan wishes. Well, I've seen that report. I've never seen it disputed. So we have these 50 tanks from the West. We have these 100 or so T-72s, plus the tanks from Morocco, plus whatever tanks Ukraine still has from its original tank fleet. We put it all together. We add to that the 100 Bradleys, the 40 Marders, the 100 Strikers, and we launch an offensive. Even though, as Brian Baletic has been talking about, over program after program on the new Atlas, it's inconceivable that Ukraine would be able to train its forces up to the level where it can use all this equipment effectively. You could get around that to some extent by using Western volunteer fighters, but I'm starting to get the sense that they're starting to be in short supply as well. So anyway, you cobble it all together over the next few weeks. You disregard the advice of your own Pentagon officials. Again, Reuters was saying just a few weeks ago that the US military was advising Ukraine to pull out of Bakhmut. They were advising Ukraine to hold back from prematurely launching offensives until they'd fully trained on how to use these tanks and armored vehicles. You ignore all of that, and you get Ukraine to launch some kind of offensive, even though everybody knows or believes they know that this offensive will most likely be launched towards Melitopol, where the Russians are waiting. As I said, it all seems borderline irrational to me. But then what do I know? Perhaps there's some kind of military trick up the West's sleeve that I'm not familiar with. If so, I haven't seen a single person explain to me what it is. But anyway, that at least seems to be the plan. A small group of people managed to gain control of Western governments, seem to be united now in leading Ukraine, or so it seems to me, towards the abyss, creating enormous danger in the international system, but they're prepared to ignore all advice, throw all words of reason and caution to one side. In fact, this article from the Financial Times all but says that they get angry and frustrated when these sound sensible words of advice are conveyed to them. Well, I say that some people, everybody seems to be throwing reason to one side. I must quickly add that one person has finally said something which seems to make some sort of sense. President Zelensky, who was just a few days ago, talking about defending Bakhmut basically to the last man, has given an interview to the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, in which he said that, Bakhmut isn't so important, it's not such a big place. Of course, Ukraine will withdraw from Bakhmut rather than sacrifice its forces in the kind of way that he himself has suggested in the past. Perhaps, just possibly, some logic at least in Kiev, is trying is starting to take hold. Perhaps he is finally listening to the advice of those who supposedly, allegedly, perhaps, just possibly include General Zelensky, but certainly do seem to include US uniformed military people. The advice they've been giving him, for heaven's sake, pull your men out of Bakhmut. You're only doing what Yan Gagin, that Russian official that I talked about earlier, was saying. You're just sending more and more of your men to die to no ultimate or useful purpose. Maybe President Zelensky has finally acknowledged this, and perhaps that's what this interview with Corriere della Sera suggests. I have to say that I'm not convinced. It was, after all, an interview with an Italian newspaper. If President Zelensky had said this in one of his broadcasts to the Ukrainian people, I would be taking these words of his a lot more seriously. It may just be that President Zelensky said this because he wanted to deflect criticism from the Italian journalists about this sacrifice of Ukrainian lives on the altar of holding on to Bakhmut. But perhaps there's another factor as well. Perhaps something else is happening. Perhaps President Biden got wind of these words of Zelensky's about Bakhmut. Perhaps he and his national security advisor are indeed worried that there is a weakening of President Zelensky's resolve. Perhaps that was what decided President Biden to go to Kiev after he said that he wouldn't do so. Well, the last is a very, very big guess. Probably not the case. I have to say, in truth, that this visit does look as if it was carefully planned. But I just throw it out because apart from these words of President Zelensky, all the language, all the talk, not from the military people, not from the logistics people, not from the economic staff, not from some of the perhaps more level-headed Western leaders, or not level-headed Western leaders, at least those who retain some tenuous connection to reality, people like Scholz and perhaps Macron. Well, they all seem to be saying this is not turning out well. We've got ourselves stuck in a long war. We're not winning it. We're overinvested in it. That's what the world is saying. But the people in charge seem to be determined to hang on. This is a tragedy which is getting worse, not just by the day, but by the hour. We're all, Ukraine first and foremost, of course, trapped inside this runaway train, and there seems to be no way of getting off. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. More from me soon. In the meantime, just to remind you, you can find all our programs, all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin, and Telegram. Links under this video. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links also under this video. And if you go under this to the links under this video, you can also find links to our shop where you can buy all sorts of great things. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, just to say, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.